Good evening, and welcome to the Obscura Institute. The lamps are lit, the archive is open, and tonight we draw a single file down from the shelves. File 12. The Aerial School Encounter. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin. The air that September morning was dry the way it gets at the very end of the dry season, when the rains are still weeks off and everything has been waiting a long time for them. The light was hard and flat and came down without much kindness. Out behind the classrooms there was a playground with the grass worn off it, mostly bare ground, and a few play structures. And past the playground there was a fence, and past the fence the land went into low brush and short trees that ran out perhaps 100 meters before becoming nothing in particular. The children were told not to go there, which is the reason every single one of them knew exactly where it was. The school was called Ariel on Teresa Road in Ruwa, a town about 22 kilometers southeast of Harare, close enough that a good number of people commuted into the city, far enough out that the land still opened into farm plots and scrub. It was a young school then, only 3 years old, begun in an old farmhouse on the property with 4 classes and 75 pupils, and by that spring it had grown into a proper independent primary, grades 1 through 7, drawing largely from comfortable Harare families. Friday the 16th of September, 1994. Mid-morning, around 10 o'clock, the tail end of the dry season in the southern hemisphere. And the teachers were all indoors. Every account of this case agrees on that point. The staff were in a meeting which left the children out on the grounds during morning break with no adult watching them, so that not a single teacher saw what the children later described. Whatever happened or didn't happen in that field happened in an unsupervised 15 minutes. What follows is what the children said, recorded early and recorded often, and it is the reason there is a file at all. What they said was that something came down beyond the fence, out past the wire, in the part of the field they weren't allowed to walk in. The descriptions varied in their particulars, which is itself worth noting. Most of the children spoke of a silver object, round or elliptical, lustrous, with a white or golden glow to it, and some described windows, and some described a door, and some described lights or landing gear beneath it. 2 children mentioned black or green stripes on the hull. 1 child drew it red. One account describes 3 objects rather than 1, appearing and disappearing. The object, they said, came to rest at the far side of the field, out in the off-limits scrub, roughly 100 meters from where they stood. And then, according to them, there were figures out there with it, somewhere between 1 and 4 of them, depending on which child you ask, about a meter tall, which is child height, or a little less. They were dressed in shiny black one-piece clothing that several of the pupils compared to a wetsuit. The eyes were the detail nearly all of them returned to, very large and very black. Some spoke of long black hair. One child said a figure vanished from the ground and reappeared on top of the craft. Some of the pupils reached for the frame they had closest to hand, describing what they'd seen in the language of local folklore, Zvikwambo, Tokoloshe, the small malevolent beings of Shona and southern African tradition. When you see something you have no word for, you borrow the nearest word you own. Whatever they thought they saw, the children ran, and a good many of them were crying as they went. The first adult they reached was not a teacher, but Mrs. Alison Kirkman, a physiotherapist and an aerial parent who happened to be volunteering in the tuck shop, the little school shop that sells sweets and crisps at break, and who was, that morning, the only adult on the grounds not sitting in the staff meeting. Children came pelting up to her, saying there was a little black man out beyond the fence, and she assumed it was a prank because she had a shop full of unattended stock and a queue of children, and she wasn't going to abandon either to go and look at something she was fairly certain wasn't there. And so nobody went to look, which is one of the quiet, frustrating facts at the center of this case. In the window, when a footprint or a flattened patch of brush might have meant something, the only adult available made an entirely reasonable decision, and the moment passed. The staff meeting ended, and the children came in from break in a state, and the initial response was very much what you'd expect. Disbelief, mostly. The sense that something had gone round the playground and taken hold the way stories do among children. Nobody's first instinct was to believe it. But the headmaster, Colin Mackey, did something that turned out to matter a great deal. He had the pupils who claimed to have seen something produce two things, a drawing and a written account in their own words. It is the single most valuable act anyone performed in the whole affair, and it's worth being precise about what it does and doesn't prove. The drawings are frequently described as having been made that same day, before the children could compare notes, and the honest version is a little softer than that. About 40 drawings, give or take, gathered over the days that followed. So the drawings came over days, not in one sealed hour, which weakens the argument that there was no time to compare notes, though it doesn't erase their value, because they were still made within days by children no investigator had yet coached, and they remain the earliest physical record in the file, earlier than any journalist, any researcher, any camera. And what they show is a set of accounts that agree strongly on some things and diverge on others. The large black eyes recur, and the small stature recurs, and the shiny black covering recurs, while the craft itself varies quite a bit from drawing to drawing. Different shapes, different features, one in an entirely different color. A perfectly uniform set of drawings would suggest copying, and a completely scattered set would suggest nothing much happened, and what Mackey collected sits between those two, which is roughly what you'd expect, either from a group of children who all glimpsed something real from different positions, or from a group of children building on each other's telling over the course of a morning. The number of witnesses usually quoted is 62, though you'll also see 60 and 68, and their ages ran from 6 to 12. Against that, the school roll, which is genuinely poorly documented, somewhere between 200 and 250, which means that most of the children on those grounds that morning are not in the file at all. They either saw nothing or said nothing, and any account of the case has to sit with both halves of that. The first journalist on the scene was Tim Leach, a BBC journalist based in Harare, and he arrived on Monday the 19th of September, the next school day, 3 days after the event, around midday, with a sound technician. He filmed the grounds, and he filmed the staff, and he filmed the children in on-camera group interviews. Leach was not a paranormal reporter. He was a career war correspondent who had covered some of the worst of what the continent had to offer in that period, and he is widely quoted as having said something to the effect that he could handle war zones but could not handle this. The wording circulates in several versions, so it's better treated as a paraphrase than as a verbatim quote. What isn't in dispute is that the case unsettled him considerably. He phoned the American psychiatrist John Mack about it that same month, and he returned to the school on the 22nd. Leach died in 2011, and his footage from those first days underpins very nearly every documentary made about Ariel since. The day after Leach's first visit, Cynthia Hind arrived on Tuesday the 20th of September from about 10 in the morning until 11:30. Hind was Zimbabwe-based, a UFO researcher who edited a small journal on the subject and coordinated for the American organization MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, across Africa. She came with Leach and with a filmmaker. Her method has drawn substantial criticism, and the criticism is fair. She interviewed the children in groups of 4 to 6, with the other children listening, which is close to the worst possible arrangement if your goal is independent testimony, because children in a group hear what the previous child says and adjust to it. She interrupted frequently, and she supplied vocabulary. At one point, she offered a girl the phrase diving suit, and that descriptor then propagates through later accounts of the case as though the children had produced it themselves. From that afternoon on, it gets harder to tell what the children brought and what the grown-ups handed them. It doesn't invalidate everything the children said, since the earliest Leach material predates it. But from the 20th of September onward, the testimony is no longer clean. Within about 4 days then, the story had left the school entirely, belonging now to the BBC, to a UFO journal, to a documentary filmmaker, and the children would go on repeating it to strangers with cameras for the next 30 years. John Edward Mack was born in New York in October 1929, and by 1994, he was one of the more decorated psychiatrists in America and one of the more controversial. He is very often described as head of Harvard's psychiatry department, which he was not, and the correction is worth making because the inflated version does the case no favors. What he actually was, a tenured professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School from 1972 and founding chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital. Serious credentials, but not the same as running Harvard Psychiatry. In 1977, he won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for his life of T.E. Lawrence, which is the detail people find hardest to reconcile. A Pulitzer-winning biographer of Lawrence of Arabia, sitting in a Zimbabwean primary school asking children about small figures in the scrub. By the 1990s, his research had turned to people who reported being taken by non-human beings, and his position was carefully hedged. He did not claim the events were physically real, but he argued that the people reporting them were not mentally ill and that something genuine was happening to them which mainstream psychiatry had no framework for. Leach's phone call brought him to Ruwa. He came in the last weeks of the year, late November or the first days of December, 2.5 months after that morning. The numbers are routinely inflated in the retellings, so they're worth stating plainly. 62 children reported something. Mack interviewed 12 of them, along with Mackey and most of the teaching staff, and only 7 of those interviews were ever publicly released. And of those 7 children, only 3 reported a telepathic message. He concluded that the children were sincere and not delusional, citing the consistency of their accounts and, importantly to him, their affect, the emotion visible in them as they spoke. And he emphasized what became the case's most famous element, a telepathic warning about the environment, about what people were doing to the earth. Here, the criticism becomes serious, and it deserves laying out properly. He arrived roughly 11 weeks after the event, by which point the children had been interviewed repeatedly on camera by 2 journalists and a UFO researcher, and there are documented leading questions in his own footage. At one point, he asks a girl, "Did you go with him, do you think?" The environmental message, meanwhile, is thin to absent in the September material, in the Leach and Hind interviews, and it becomes prominent only under Mack's questioning, and Mack himself was a committed anti-nuclear and environmental campaigner who had spent part of the 1980s researching children's anxieties about nuclear war. His own faculty later reviewed his methods, and while no disciplinary action followed and his standing was reaffirmed, the review did criticize the way he worked. Several explanations have been put forward, and some carry more weight than others. The one you'll hear most often is a rocket re-entry, and it is real and well documented. A Russian satellite had gone up at the end of August, and the spent second stage of its rocket came back down through the atmosphere on the night of the 14th of September, a slow fireball seen widely across southern Africa. Thousands of people saw it. It filled the papers. None of that is in question. But look carefully at the dates. That was 2 days before the 16th, and it was at night, and the children reported something on the ground, at close range, at 10 in the morning. The re-entry cannot be what they saw. What it can explain is the atmosphere, that southern Africa had been talking about strange lights for 2 days, and that a schoolyard was therefore primed to interpret something unusual in a particular way. Then there is media priming of another sort. A great deal of what has been written about this case leans on the idea of isolated African children with no exposure to Western television or American science fiction, which is wrong. Ariel was a fee-paying school 22 kilometers from the capital, drawing on comfortable Harare families. By 1994, the saucer and the small figure with the large dark eyes were among the most widely circulated images in the world. They knew what a spaceship was supposed to look like. Then there is what psychologists call social contagion, which is what happens when one child sees something or says they do, and the others fill it in around them. It is well established in the literature. It moves quickly among children. And the more excited and unsupervised the group, the faster it moves. 62 children, no adults, 15 minutes. Then there is plain misidentification, a dust devil in dry September air, or sunlight glinting off a rock or off vegetation at the far side of the field, something small and unremarkable seen at 100 meters by a crowd of excited children. And then there are the adults who can be partly documented. Hind's diving suit. Max, did you go with him? Whatever the children originally saw, the version that reached the world had passed through several grown-ups with strong prior beliefs. How much can these carry between them? A fair amount. Contagion plus misidentification plus suggestion is a coherent chain, and it explains a great deal. What it explains less well is the earliest material, the drawings collected within days, and the leech footage from the 19th, before any UFO researcher had spoken to anyone, and it sits awkwardly with the sheer distress. Children invent things constantly, but sustained, visible fear in a group that size, filmed 3 days later, is a harder thing to account for. You'll sometimes read that Ariel had a UFO club or a history of playground UFO talk. That's weakly sourced and shouldn't be leaned on. 30 years on, several of those children are adults who still speak about it. One of them, Emily Trim, who was about 8 that morning and who later lived in Canada, became a painter and made work she described as a manifestation of the messages. She died in late 2024, still young after an illness. Salma Siddiq still maintains her account publicly, and so do others. Lucille Field, Nathaniel Coxall, Francis Chirimuta, and the Chakaodza siblings. There has been one recantation. In a Netflix series in 2023, a man who had been among the children said he made the whole thing up, pointing at a rock catching the sun in order to get out of class. It's a significant claim, and it's also unverifiable and contested. Other witnesses reaffirmed their accounts and disputed his. So what does 30 years of consistency actually tell us? Consistency over decades is not evidence that an event occurred. A memory formed at 8 and rehearsed on camera at 8, at 9, at 20, at 30 becomes extremely stable. That's how memory works, and the rehearsal is the reason. These are among the most filmed child witnesses in the history of the subject, and their accounts had every opportunity to fossilize. What it does tell us is that they are not lying in any ordinary sense. A group that sighs, holding a fabrication for 3 decades across continents with no material benefit and considerable social cost, is not a plausible conspiracy. Whatever formed in those children's minds that morning, they believe it. Here is what the record contains, and what it doesn't. There is no photograph and no film of the object because Leach arrived 3 days later. There is no physical trace of any kind. There is no adult witness at all because the staff were in a meeting and the one adult who was told wouldn't leave the shop. And there is no documented mark on the ground out in the scrub, in part because nobody went and looked while it mattered. What the record does contain is roughly 40 drawings and written accounts collected by a headmaster within days. Film from a BBC war correspondent taken on the 3rd day, contaminated but early interviews from a UFO researcher on the 4th, and footage from a Pulitzer-winning psychiatrist 11 weeks later, taken under methods his own faculty went on to criticize. The skeptical chain, regional excitement about a real rocket re-entry, a familiar television image, one child's story spreading through an unsupervised group, then adults with strong beliefs shaping the retelling, accounts for most of the case, and it is the most economical explanation on offer, and anyone dismissing it isn't looking at the evidence squarely. It does not account for everything, though. It does not fully account for the distress on the earliest tapes before any investigator arrived, and it asks us to assume a good deal about a 15-minute stretch of mourning that no adult observed and no record documents. There is no version of this file in which 62 children are believed outright, and no version in which they are dismissed outright. The most likely explanation is the ordinary one. A small misperception in a dry field, amplified by a crowd and then by adults who wanted it to be more than it was. But the earliest recordings are more troubling than that summary makes them sound, and the honest position is that they have never been fully explained. The field beyond the fence is still there. The brush has grown and thinned and grown again in the 30-odd years since, and the light still comes down hard across it in September and goes long and golden in the late afternoon before it goes altogether. Whatever the children saw or thought they saw or told each other they saw, the ground itself never gave anything up, no mark, no trace, nothing pressed into the dry earth for anyone to find, and it has kept whatever it knows for 3 decades now, out past the wire, in the quiet, in the part of the field where nobody was ever supposed to walk. If you had been the first adult on that playing field in 1994, what would you have asked those children, and would you have believed the answer? We'd be glad to read your thoughts below, and that is where we leave File 12 for tonight. Thank you for spending this quiet hour in the archive. If you enjoyed this case file, a like and a subscribe genuinely help the Institute grow, and turning on notifications means the next file finds you the moment it opens. The lamps will stay lit and the Institute will be here whenever you wish to return. Until then, rest well.